Welcome. Good evening. I am John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. When I was 2 years old, it was a very bad year when President Truman took us to war in Korea without a declaration of war from Congress. When I was 17 years old, it was a very bad year when President Johnson took us to war in Vietnam without a declaration of war from Congress. Skipping forward, when I was 55 years old, it was a very bad year when President Bush 43 took us to war in Afghanistan and Iraq without a declaration of war. Now, last weekend was a very bad weekend when President Trump took us to war in Iran without a declaration of war. Tonight, we will step back and ask ourselves, how in the world did we get here? I founded the Committee for the Republic to end forever wars. Empires fight forever wars. The American Republic was designed to stop the country from going to war. That's the reason we're called the Committee for the Republic. The committee believes that the greatest crisis facing the United States is our constitutional crisis. And our constitutional crisis is the breakdown of separation of powers. The greatest breakdown of separation of powers is the executive usurpation and the congressional abdication of the war power. So, how do we restore separation of powers and the war power? We make the American Republic great again. To make our republic great again, we need to make Congress great again. And to make Congress great again, we must make separation of powers great again. To restore our republic, we must end our empire. To end our empire, we must stop electing politicians who violate their oath of office to uphold the Constitution. Now, uniquely among history's greatest political thinkers, and that includes Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Montesquieu, and Locke, James Madison understood the incorrigible exaltation of war. Madison recognized that mankind would self-destruct without institutional handcuffs on the propensity of our species towards war. Thus, Madison's constitutional separation of powers was born, specifically entrusting the war power to Congress with no political or personal incentives to exercise the power, but in self-defense to actual or imminent aggression. Indeed, Madison proclaimed the Congressional war power was the Constitution's crown jewel. He said, and I quote, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confines the question of war and peace to the legislature and not to the executive." Tonight's speaker needs no introduction. Bruce Fein is my vice chairman for a reason. Bruce has the deepest understanding of Madison and is the best separation of powers lawyer. Bruce can explain better than anyone why war is mankind's biggest problem and how Madison's general theory of man led to his separation of powers invention to cage the beast of war. Bruce, over to you.
Okay, I think we overcame these occupational hazards. So I begin again. I compliment John on that wonderful introduction. I want to go to the basics here as to why separation of powers was so central to James Madison's thinking. And it comes largely from Federalist 47, where he recognized that the whole reason why we have government at all is because men are not angels, and they need handcuffs on their own tendency towards evil, war, killing, and otherwise. And that is why he resorted to separation of powers to pit what he said, ambition against ambition, the sociopaths against the sociopaths. So no particular faction can dominate another, and we restrain the natural propensity of the species towards war and domination. Now, it's very, very difficult for certainly our country and the species in general to accept that recognition of the depravity of our species. We are far more than any other species inclined to kill. We celebrate and honor those who have proficiency in killing. We engage in industrial scale, massive killing of other human beings that no other animal does, whether it's at Tokyo or in the extermination camps or in Gaza or in Ukraine or in Myanmar, anyway, the Democratic of Congo. Warfare has been endemic from the beginning of time. And it isn't always warfare for natural resources. It's oftentimes warfare for the sake of domination. We get introduced, perhaps in our education, to the Greek-Trojan War, which is fought over Helen of Troy, and King Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to death so that the winds would subside so he could sail to Troy to engage in killing. But all species, Darwin recognized, are narcissistic because the goal of all species is survival for the sake of survival, devoid of any moral content. If it leads to survival, that trait will reproduce and become accentuated. And if you just want to survive, you want to have the fewest inhibitions on killing, slaughtering, dominating the planet. Now, because of species narcissism, it's very difficult, and you won't find it in any of your textbooks. No one will stand up and recognize, because of very unpleasant wisdom to acquire, that we are the worst of all the species when it comes to moral content. We kill on a scale no other species does for the most trivial reasons. So you need to understand the depravity of the species to recognize why separation of powers is important. Without separation of powers, every other country in the world, and we are unique in entrusting the war power to Congress, all their history is just one warfare after another. That is what we encounter today, but for 100 and some years before we dismantled separation of powers, about the time of the Spanish-American War, we were largely out of war. We did have a civil war. There was one war with Mexico, but by and large, over a century, we resisted the temptation to invade Central Latin America in rebellion against the Spanish and Portuguese empires. And we grew very fast. It was the peacetime that was kept because of separation. Presidents from time to time wanted the United States to acquire Cuba. The Congress resisted. Ulysses Grant wanted us to take over Santo Domingo and Dominican Republic. The Congress resisted. They said, why are we doing that? Even as early as 1826, the executive wanted us to attend some America conference to build so-called peace throughout North America and South America. And the Congress again resisted. We don't need to have anyone go there. I underscore this important fact because if you don't understand why separation of powers is there, you don't understand how important it is to fight to keep it and maintain it. You'll think it's more, well, it's just an academic brainchild of James Madison. Why does it really matter? You can have separation or not. It doesn't really have a whole lot of real world impact, but the opposite of true. It has a staggering real world impact. And we see it in the United States that once separation of powers basically disintegrated around 1900, actually a few years earlier, we've been at constant warfare. Sometimes it's open and notorious. Sometimes it's just projecting our military abroad without necessarily going in war, but we certainly are on a war footing. If you look at 1900, we were in Mexico, we're in Panama, we're in Nicaragua, we're in Haiti, we're in the Dominican Republic, we're in Honduras. This is even before we end up in World War I, when our projection of military force was even greater. And of course, we were constantly in Cuba after the Spanish-American War, intervening to try to install governments that were favorable to us. And of course, we ran at that time the Philippines War for 3 years to subjugate the Philippines, who wanted self-determination, as we proclaimed was their inherent right under the Declaration of Independence. And those are all consequences of the end of separation of powers, because the species naturally craves domination for its own sake. Now, it doesn't mean that every country will go to war automatically without separation of powers, because you need to combine the quest for domination with a capability of accomplishing it. If you're a very tiny country, maybe a few million people, you have no resources, you're not going to commit suicide and attack the United States or a superpower. But when these countries have grown in the past, grown from small to big countries, and they do acquire that force, they do act like a superpower and then try to dominate the world. Anyway, that is, and I think that Abraham Lincoln, I think in some respects, he captured, I believe, this propensity of the species for warfare in very vivid language. And he was writing as a member of Congress in opposition to the Mexican-American War. And he spoke, and I'm quoting from his speech against President James K. Polk, "The exceeding brightness of military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood, that serpent's eye that charms to destroy." And Elihu Root, who was also Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense around the time of Teddy Roosevelt in the 1900s, also spoke of how every country in the United States at that time, we all gave great deference to the armored knight, and the thinker could nowhere to be seen. That was inherent in the way in which countries operated foreign policy, especially if they didn't have the dominant authority in the Congress, which doesn't have the incentive that the executive does to go to war, since during wartime, congressional powers are diminished. Now, not only was Madison, I believe, very prescient in his theory, if we look at 235 years of experience, I believe he's completely vindicated. There have been only 5 conflicts in 235 years when Congress has declared war. In all 5 conflicts, Congress declared, we've already been attacked, we're already in a state of war, and now we're authorizing the president to fight back in self-defense. In every single case. Now, in a few cases, the president lied to Congress and got Congress to believe that, even though it was false. For example, President Polk lied to Congress, told them that Mexican soldiers had killed American soldiers on American soil, and that justified then responding with an attack on Mexico. But that was a lie. We have in World War I, as we approached the declaration of war, Woodrow Wilson falsely denying that the Lusitania that was sunk by a German submarine didn't have any munitions on it that made it a legitimate war target. It did have munitions on it. Why it sunk so fast. Anyway, the point is that in only the 5 occasions, and these are the War of 1812, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, then the Mexican-American War, in every case, the congressional declaration was, we're already at war because we've been attacked. Now, if we look at what has happened without the congressional declarations, presidents are going to war all of the time, whether or not we're attacked. And we know that when Congress has been asked outside these 5 occasions to go to war when we haven't been attacked, it said no. Most recently, in 1998, President William Jefferson Clinton asked Congress for a declaration of war against Serbia because of its alleged maltreatment of the Kosovar Albanians. Congress voted it down. Clinton went to war anyway. My good friend Tom Campbell was a member of Congress. He sued Clinton, but he lacked standing. So he lost the case called Campbell versus Clinton. More recently, in 2013, President Barack Obama asked Congress for a declaration of war against Syria because of Assad's alleged use of chemical weapons. Congress, they didn't even bring it to a floor vote. They couldn't even get the bill out of committee. They will not vote for it. So Obama just decided, I'll just go to war on my own, which he did, and Congress has no pushback. We see the same thing, I think, with regard to the breakdown of separation of powers, with the anemic response that Congress, even at its high watermark, has made to President Trump's notorious attack on Iran without any congressional declaration of war or otherwise. You have resolutions, not impeachment, which is the only remedy there is, and the framers expected it to be the remedy for an unconstitutional war, saying, gee, Mr. President, you really need to come to Congress to get a declaration of war. Now, there was something similar that happened to try to end the Vietnam War that way. You may recall in 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, again, based in part on a lie that President Johnson told about a fake second torpedo attack in the Gulf of Tonkin against an American vessel. Anyway, putting that aside, it was used, although really it wasn't a declaration of war. It basically said, President Johnson, do whatever you want in Southeast Asia because we think you're smart. But even with that authorization, in 1970, Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, repealed it. President Nixon said, fine, you repealed it, and he kept the Vietnam War going at least till 1973 without breaking stride. So, and presidents, with that track record, you know that President Trump would not pay any attention to a resolution, even if it was enacted by both houses. I mean, in a similar way, he decided on his own and continues as we're speaking today. He didn't want to pay any attention to the congressional ban on TikTok, so just says, well, I'm not going to enforce it for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, however long he wants to. Moreover, the resolutions that Congress are addressing come under the War Powers Resolution of 1973. No president ever has even accepted the constitutionality of the War Powers Resolution, which is a kind of redundancy anyway, since the Declare War Clause enforces itself, just like the First Amendment. We don't have a First Amendment resolution that says the president needs to comply with the prohibitions on abridging free speech or freedom of religion. It's self-executing. But you'll find that there is nothing right now that's serious in Congress that's pushing back against Mr. Trump. Now, why is that? It's because the American people are quiescent. There are no demands that Congress do anything. In contrast, in 2013, when Obama asked for a declaration of war against Syria, every single office was bombarded by American citizens saying, no, we do not want to go to war with Syria. It was virtually universal. And you can ask members of Congress, including Thomas Madison, yeah, no member was going to go because they had no public support whatsoever. If that kind of reception was in congressional offices today, Congress might at least vote something that was serious about stopping the war, at least temporarily, like intermission at a football game has stopped. But we see, as happened in Gaza, their intermission is likely to be relatively short before the war begins again. And there is an alternate way, I believe, other than impeachment, in which you could bring the war to a close. It's more difficult because it requires some overcoming headwinds from the executive. And the model was set by the Congress in connection with the Vietnam War. They passed a statute that said, no monies of the United States can be expended to conduct combat operations over Indochina after August 15th, 1973. That was the end of the war. President Ford tried to reignite the war in 1975 when the North totally overran the South. Congress said, no, there's no money. The war ended. So there is an appropriations approach. It is less, I believe, aggressive than impeachment because a president can veto an appropriations measure, and then you need a two-thirds veto to override it. Whereas that doesn't happen in impeachment, the president has no role at all. Moreover, the appropriations measure, I believe, is just one targeted conflict. I believe that if you actually had an impeachment of a president for an illegal, unconstitutional war, it would never happen again. Presidents love power, like members of Congress. They'll say, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that because I want to stay in power. Also, think of this, I think, that reinforces Madison's wisdom. Ask, why would a president not ask Congress for a declaration of war if the president thought he could get one? Because if there is a declaration, the president then has political coverage. If the war goes south, he says, Congress voted the declaration. What do you want me to do? I have to comply with them. The reason why presidents don't ask for congressional declarations, because they don't think they can get it, no matter what the verbal pyrotechnics are. You can read a lot of the hawks right now, for example, in the Congress, Lindsey Graham. Well, Trump could easily get a declaration of war. Then why doesn't he ask for it? What would be the incentive for Mr. Trump not to ask for a congressional declaration if he could get it? Because he fears he couldn't get a congressional declaration of war. Because despite all the verbal pyrotechnics, there's nothing in it for Congress. And they're in power for themselves. Just the president. Why should we vote this? We're going to get no footprints in the sand of time. We don't get any extra power. We don't get to appoint the generals. We don't get any monuments built after us. It's a nothing for the Congress to do that. So it's not going to vote a declaration of war unless we're in fact attacked. And of course, Iran has not attacked the United States, certainly not here. Maybe they have attacked forces that are in Iraq or nearby Iran, but they shouldn't. Our forces shouldn't be there anyway. So that is where we are today. I believe that, unfortunately, because there's a great deficit in instructing through the civics courses in the American people why we have separation of powers, why we need to check ourselves from this tendency towards self-ruination, that there isn't the conviction, there isn't the strength of public opinion to stop this mad approach on the doomsday clock to midnight. Now, one thing I will mention, and it's not very positive. I'm convinced that given time is infinite and our capacity for destroying ourselves grows by the moment, that it's inevitable that we will exterminate ourselves. We will make ourselves extinct. It could be either by a nuclear explosion or otherwise. There has been 80 years that have elapsed since Alamogordo and Oppenheimer's famous or infamous "Now I'm Death, the Destroyer of Worlds" after the explosion of the atomic bomb in New Mexico. 80 years. At least in one occasion, during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet naval person was given instructions: you need to launch a tactical nuclear weapon against the United States. He thought it was an error. He checked again and they said, yeah, it is an error. There's miscommunication. But we came very close to having nuclear Armageddon. It was clear, if you get the debates within the Kennedy administration around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, how close we were to bombing Cuba anyway, that could have triggered nuclear exchanges. And also remember, what was the risk averseness of the United States at that time? In 1962, we had 27,000 nuclear warheads. Cuba, even with the high water mark of the Soviet missiles and warheads in Cuba, had like 160 some. We had 27,000 to 160. And given that tiny risk that Cuba was going to attack us, knowing it would be obliterated with our nuclear arsenal, we decided we would go to the brink of destroying the entire species. So given that risk averseness, I believe, it's a matter of time until we have some kind of Armageddon between powers, by accident or otherwise, wanting to dominate the globe, and will destroy the species. Everyone will blow up. Now, it may be 2 years, it could be 200 years. But since time is infinite and the risk is at least more than zero, it's inevitable that it will happen. So that's the presentation, John. I want to ask questions and go to the audience now.
Good. Thank you, Bruce. Before we open it up, what do you, just how dangerous do you think the current situation is? You talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis. How much? I think we're the closest to on the doomsday clock. Where are we on the doomsday clock?
It's just only a few seconds towards midnight. So where are we on the nuclear issue? Number one, I believe that the incentive or the imperative of Iran to have a nuclear weapon may well drive us to a similar crisis. At least there have been some suggestion that President of Russia, Putin, offered to offer some nuclear help to Iran. There's A.Q. Khan in Pakistan, who proliferated nuclear technology everywhere before he's put under house arrest. That's how Libya acquired its nukes. But I believe that what makes this, I think, different than other crises, John, and Iran different, is twofold reasons. One is that Iran saw what happened to Libya. When Libya abandoned WMD, then that was the end of Gaddafi, came in. Libya right now is basically a wilderness. Got all sorts of warlords running around. It's a horrible place. And so I think, especially with insinuations by Netanyahu and Trump that they're looking for regime change, the mullahs looking and saying, there's no way, whatever we say, we have to have a nuclear backup. Otherwise, we'll be invaded and destroyed. We've already given them one lesson in 1953 when we orchestrated the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh, the only democratically elected prime minister ever in the history of Iran. And then that was in favor of the Shah. The Shah was then overthrown in the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So our batting average on regime change isn't very high, but we may try it again. But the point is that I think Iran feels we need this, not only because they're threatened by the United States. They look at Israel. One of the things that, to my mind, is so conspicuous about all the ink spilled over this recent clashes, nobody's mentioned two things at least. Israel's not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. They haven't agreed to abandon nuclear weapons. And two, it's notorious that they've got anywhere between probably 100 and 400 nuclear warheads at Dimona. And number three, it's notorious that they lied repeatedly to the United States about acquiring, nuclear material to build their nuclear warheads. So you can imagine Iran looking and say, Israel has all these nuclear warheads, far more than Iran could ever have, certainly in the short run. They're not signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, whereas Iran is. And yet you're asking us to renounce nuclear weapons, and our neighbor who's insinuating regime change gets to keep all these in an arsenal. Whatever is on paper, the likelihood that Iran would honor it, I think, is very, very low for these reasons that are not fantastical. They see exactly what the United States and Israel have at heart, and they fear we need them. We need the nuclear weapons, otherwise we'll be completely destroyed. Now that means it may well be, because there's still going to be, I believe, a very, very strong argument in Iran for nuclear weapons. It could end up our bombing them and they're using one nuclear weapon in response, even if it's just one, and then there's nuclear winter. Who knows after that point whether things could change. I do know that at least initially, after the bombings, and even before, you do not find in Iran, even those who hate the mullahs, and I hate the mullahs too, I think they're horrible. You don't find the Iranians say, come on, Israel, the United States, occupy Tehran, take us over, let us be your servants. They're rallying like you would expect, because they have sense of nationalism too. They don't want to be treated, like little tiny serfs on a plantation. And so the attack, moreover, has strengthened, in my judgment, the mullahs, who were not very popular anyway, because the Iranians don't want to be seen as subservient to Israel or the United States. I make this one, maybe it's an anecdote, and the analogies are always imperfect because situations are not always the same. But years ago, when we were bombing Sarajevo, when Slobodan Milosevic was in power and he was doing dastardly things, I was over at the Serbian embassy and was talking on other things, and the people who were in the embassy at that time said the only time they ever had any kind thought about Milosevic was when we started to drop bombs on Sarajevo, and then they felt angry at the United States. So in some ways, the attack is counterproductive because it's produced a unity in Iran that wasn't as strong before. I'm not suggesting that they necessarily could have overthrown the mullahs, even irrespective of what the United States did. Tyrannies stay around for a long time. Ultimately, they crumble, but they can have 100 years, even longer existences. But anyway, that's why, John, I believe this crisis with Iran has a potential to go nuclear more than some other conflicts.
Bruce, why do you think the Constitution hasn't been the battleground in American politics in the last 230 some years? We've got a lot of questions in the chat here, basically asking, how do we get out of this mess constitutionally? And
no,
so
it's a wonderful it's a wonderful question, John. And if we think about the early stages of American politics at the time of ratification, even when you had very, very vocal opponents, and indeed you can trace back, Patrick Henry was a very vocal opponent of the Constitution. But when it was ratified, he said, listen, we had our say, we had our arguments, we lost, now we're going to back it. Okay. So there was a uniform adherence to Constitution, separation of powers. There really wasn't all that much debate, certainly not about separation. There was free speech debate about the Alien Sedition Acts and things like that. But with regard to separation, no, there wasn't. In fact, we had a period that was called the era of good feelings. Basically, from 1800 to 1824, their party system really broke down, and there was only one party, the National Republicans. But I think the reason that the system broke down, and I always repeat, if it's a complex issue, very seldom is there just one cause. There are more than one cause. I see that there was a couple of things, John. One, at the outset, which was not necessarily a good thing in terms of our ambitions of Declaration of Independence, we had a limited franchise, and those who were in the power structure, they're very, very gifted. They're very educated. They understood these things when Madison was talking about that Rome, and he was talking about Socrates, and talking about the ancient Athenian Empire. People knew what he was talking about, and they appreciated the danger that would come if they entrusted the executive power, the war power, to the president. But I think that, and this is where I believe that they're contrary, attitudes to have. When we moved, to first universal manhood suffrage by 1828, and then we're electing Andrew Jacksons and Martin Van Buren's. These are not people who were present at the creation, so to speak. And it takes a relatively high degree of education to appreciate the wisdom of separation, because the ordinary person, and I don't want to sound condescending, they see politics in terms of personalities, not in terms of process. Okay, Andy Jackson will save us. Okay, Abe Lincoln will. They don't see the process that's at stake. Unless there's exceptional education, this is why process matters, right? And I believe that in general, if we look at how the power on the good side has been more flat, as we expanded the franchise, said, listen, the Declaration says government by the consent of the governed. If you're governed, you ought to have a vote. Well, that happened. The power then descended to persons who had a hard time thinking of politics other than in terms of personalities. And they think if our personality is there, hey, everything will be wonderful. But it isn't wonderful. And by that time, by 1900, that's one phenomenon. But there's another one that comes into play, John, that I think is equally important. And that is when we were born as a nation, we had about 3 million whites, maybe 1 million slaves. We were 13 small colonies, independent sovereigns on the Atlantic coast. There's no way, and we didn't have any standing army. We had our economy was largely agricultural at that time. There wasn't any way that we really could have a sensible ambition to be an empire. We're too tiny. We didn't have the economic resources. We didn't have the military resources to even think about it. Just like if you go to Liechtenstein, no one there is thinking about an empire. But as we then grew from those 13 states across the continent, and we became, by being at peace, the greatest economic power in the world by the end of the 1800s, then the temptation arose. Then it wasn't just an academic issue anymore. Hey, we could be an empire if we want to now, because we're now out producing Germany and Britain and steel, and we got a navy that can sail around the world, and we have the military prowess that we didn't have before. Then it became a real issue. And I believe the temptation became too great. We decided, yep, let's call it a white man's burden. We'll replace the British Empire. We didn't like the British anyway, so we figured, okay, we'll replace the British Empire. They'll kind of fade into the sunset, and we would rather have world domination than celebrate liberty in the March of the Mind. And I believe that's what's happened. Now, what is the remedy for this? There's not a magic bullet here. We understand Congress will respond to American public opinion because they want to stay in office. We understand Congress has no incentive, and they won't, and they haven't voted for war, even by doing nothing, for decades. And the history of 235 years only voted for war when we've been attacked, which is what we want them to do. I want Congress to vote to war if we've been attacked. But Congress will react as they did against Obama, as they did against Clinton, if the American people, again, email, write in, phone calls, we don't want to go to war unless we're attacked. Not because it means we bring paradise to the world. Mankind's made of crooked timber. The world's going to be imperfect, even if the United States is as perfect as we can be. But we know going to war unless we're attacked is a cure worse than the disease. Look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Somalia, look at all these other places. The reason is because when you go to war, the law is silent. War legalizes first-degree murder in peacetime. War is the worst kind of arrangement if you're celebrating liberty and the rule of law. Just think of this phenomenon. We had Mr. Brokaw celebrated World War II, the winners, the greatest generation. Well, I'm sure there were many great heroes, and I do not all want to deprecate courage in wartime when your life is at stake and you're killing the enemy. But what did the greatest generation do, among other things? We put in concentration camps, 120,000 Japanese Americans. No one was protesting. They were all innocent because we said, oh, they have blood ties to the emperor, even if there's no evidence. I mean, God is crazy. As a General DeWitt, after he surveyed the West Coast after Pearl Harbor, he said, there's no evidence of espionage or sabotage. That's because they're plotting treason, and they're so smart, they're not going to commit any crimes. That's truly Alice in Wonderland. I say that's like the not yet guilty. All these Japanese Americans, they're not yet guilty to go into concentration camps. That's a pretty horrible blight on the United States of America. 120,000 people, their lives destroyed. In 1988, we made amends, made a little bit of reparations. Those are the kind of mistakes you make. And we see that, although it's not directly related to the Iran war, we see that now when we have this empire mentality on immigration, taking people to El Salvador, taking them to South Sudan. There's no hearing, there's no due process. And it really is quite unfaithful to the moral idea that really made the United States different from every other country in the history of the world. The idea that it's better that a few scoundrels escape justice than that the innocent suffer. We put up these procedural safeguards because we say, no, we never want to have an innocent person suffer, even if it means a couple of others go free. No other country in the history of the world has ever adopted and acted according to that precept. And that's what we have to return to. But I'm going back to the question, how do we get there? It's education, education, education. We have to get away from thinking of politics in terms of personalities. We happen to talk about what we're facing today in Iran. It is not a Trump problem alone. This problem began at least 100 years ago. It's not a personality problem. It's an institutional problem. Unless we fix the institution, I don't care, and I've said this repeatedly, whoever replaces Donald Trump is not going to give back any of his power unless Congress forces it by saying we're going to impeach you. They're going to keep it. That's been true ever since the presidency, beginning with George Washington. No president ever surrendered power back to the Congress or the people.
So it comes down to, can we get candidates to run for office, which will put the Constitution ahead of the policy preferences of their party? And,
yes, of course.
That's something that you and I are spending some time on now. I'm designing an avatar of James Madison to teach constitutional literacy, and then we can use that for candidates who want to run for office in the next congressional cycle. There's so much money in the presidential race, in the Senate races, that the House is the place to start. And in the House, the bad news is that it's gerrymandered, and the good news on this subject is that it is gerrymandered, because that means there are only about 60 seats that are battleground districts that will, a few can go one or the other and switch whether the Democrats or the Republicans control the House. And if we get in early in those races, early in the year next year, with candidates that will make the pledge to do that they'll put the Constitution first, which is what they have to do if they win the race. They have to put their hand on the Bible under Article 6 in order to assume office. They can't take office unless they swear to uphold the Constitution. So we would make sure that those candidates understood exactly what that means and spell out all the things. And you have designed, I don't know how many remedies. There's a whole legislative package of things that we would do to put in to make that true. But we'd have to have candidates who not only had score well on the constitutional literacy test and understand what the oath means, but they would also have to have the courage. Every time we give these Defender of Liberty awards, and we have Ted Postal tonight here, I see, who we gave the award to, and I want to call on Ted shortly. We always quote Aristotle's greatest idea was that without courage, it's the most important virtue, because all the others would not be possible if you don't have courage. It's the enabling virtue. So we're looking for candidates who will put the Constitution first and then have the courage. And right now, I think we're in a situation where that people say they care about the Constitution, but we have a crime, and we don't have
no punishment,
and the punishment is impeachment. We've seen in the Republican Party that people will take on the president on legislation or on the the recent war with Iran, but and say that it's unconstitutional. But it's another step to say it's an impeachable offense and act. So it seems like the limit of where we are right now in the public in Congress is that you can object on constitutional grounds, but you don't have any remedy. You're not willing to force votes, even if you lose, and that's what we need in office. And so I don't know if you want to comment on that before we open it up.
Yeah. Well, John, here is just for the audience. See, I've drafted a legislative package. It's called Restore the Constitution. I drafted bills. They're like about 20 bills. So this is how, if Congress enacted these statutes, Constitution would be restored. Okay. Of course, right now we haven't gotten anybody to introduce them, but the work is done. We know what Congress has to do. It's just a matter of getting the political will to do it. And there are very few that were. I believe that the last one in Congress who had that will, and we celebrated him, Walter Jones, and I cherish him more and more every day. And I again, this is not a personal issue, but let me show you, or give you an example of someone who I believe is defected to the opposition. One of the members of Congress at the time when we were working with Congressman Walter Jones was Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii. She actually co-sponsored a resolution that we drafted with Walter to make presidential wars impeachable offenses. Well, that was then. This is now. She's in the executive branch. She's the director of national intelligence. Have you heard say anything about unconstitutional wars, what President Trump is doing? Silence. Because I'm not trying to pick on her other than I have personal knowledge. Her power and prominence is more important than principle. Let me give you another example. It was not Tulsi Gabbard, it's Joe Biden. Joe Biden in 2007, when he was seeking the presidency, the nomination, he denounced George W. Bush for threatening to attack Iran. And he went on Chris Matthews' hardball and he shouted, "I am going to lead the charge to impeach George W. Bush if he attacks Iran without a declaration of war." And then he goes on and says, "I know my stuff. I talk to all the smart people at Harvard and Yale. I teach separation of powers. I chair the Judiciary and Foreign Affairs Committee. I know this is unconstitutional," right? That's 2007. What happens when he's in vice president? We find the president's war against Libya. Does Biden say anything? Zero. Says nothing on that score. And Biden himself, when he becomes president, he says, "I'm going to war against China if it attacks Taiwan." He said it 4 times. "I'm not going to Congress." He said repeatedly, "I'm going to war against any country that attacks a NATO member." He said it over and over again. Wait, what happened, Joe? It used to be that those were impeachable offenses, but he got to be in the executive branch, and so he changed his mind. Like most politicians, they're human weather vanes. So I point that out just two examples. I could give others, but we need concessions to the shortness of life here, because it shows you how rare and how cherished we must be for someone like Walter Jones. We need to celebrate and honor these people. We need to build pedestals to people like Walter Jones. They're so rare. And that's what we need. In addition to having brain power, they need to get social applause and acclaim for being principled. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen today. And I say, in one sense, I am kind of wandering here. The media is the problem too. In part, the media calls up and says, "Hey, will you engage in a gladiatorial battle with your opponent?" Well, it's a gray area. This is a problem of principle here, not personalities. The media will say, "We don't want you. Don't want you on the show. We just want fireworks there, no matter how stupid and brainless it is." So that's where our culture is today, and it's very, very unfortunate. That's what makes the challenge so great. But if we want to go back, in addition, John, to finding a candidate, we also need to go to the civics lessons. How are our kids being taught in school? What's in their textbooks? Even the fairy tales, trying to celebrate the William Tells for challenging tyranny and celebrating liberty. It's not, this is not something that has happened all at once. It's accumulated over a century. So it can't be cured until we have a very long and sustained effort on this direction.
Thank you, Bruce. I see Ted Postal is with us tonight. Ted, I think you're in Boston. Ted has a number of very interesting. We gave Ted the Defender of Liberty Award because he's the leading expert on missile defense, both strategic and tactical missile defense, and that's certainly a big part of this conflict. And why don't we get into a little of that with you, Ted? And also, Ted has a lot to say about these 30,000-ton bombs, these bunker busters. And Ted, are you there? Can
you hear me?
Yeah.
And I don't know, can you see me? I can't tell if you can see me or not.
I can see you, Ted. This is
you can see me. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess I can talk.
You have the floor.
All right. Well, I have been thinking about and talking to the public about an important ancillary issue, not as fundamental as Bruce is raising, because I think Bruce's points are more fundamental than the questions I am addressing. But I have been looking at the effects of this unprovoked American attack on Iran by the Trump administration and also by Israel. The United States was fully aware of the Israeli plans to attack Iran, and we basically allowed it to occur. And then, of course, we picked up the cudgel and then attacked Iran ourselves when the Israelis failed to accomplish what they were claiming was the objective of. Actually, they were claiming initially the objective was regime change. And then they talked about ending the nuclear enrichment program of Iran. And I think Bruce has already pointed out the obvious, that you attack a country, the citizens pull together, they put aside their differences. But the issue of attacking the nuclear enrichment program of Iran is really problematic. In fact, I think one can make a powerful argument that the Israeli attack, of course, supported by the United States, in fact, also supported kinetically by the United States as well, has in fact, in terms of its strategic impetus, created a situation where within the Iranian government, those people who want to go ahead and build atomic weapons have stronger arguments than ever, because I think a good circumstantial case can be made that if Iran had a few nuclear weapons, Israel would never have attacked it that way. Keep in mind that Israel may have a large number of nuclear weapons relative to Iran, but Iran only needs a very small number of nuclear weapons delivered against Tel Aviv and Haifa and maybe Beersheba and some other important cities to basically cripple Israel forever. I mean, for the foreseeable future. So there is an asymmetry here. The asymmetry may be the firepower that Israel can bring to bear in terms of conventional arms relative to what Iran can do, but the vulnerability of Israel to a catastrophic event, if it's nuclear, is much higher than that of Iran. And by instigating this attack and specifically going after the nuclear enrichment program, the Israelis and the Americans chose to execute a military action that any careful, thought out analysis of the situation would have led to the conclusion that it was almost impossible to do. The chances of succeeding were, by all practical measures, zero. So all you would do would be to attack and do damage to Iran, but you would not prevent them from going ahead, proceeding to build atomic bombs so that they could use this against you in the future. So you essentially you're pushing Iran into a situation where we cannot be sure anymore that Iran won't choose to go ahead and build nuclear weapons. Now, the reason, one of the many reasons why Iran has wisely chosen to not build nuclear weapons, but one of the important reasons is if Iran became a nuclear power, it's very hard to see how Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt would not respond by becoming nuclear powers as well. So we would have a major breakdown in the Middle East with regard to nuclear weapon states, all of which have the potential to get into trouble with regard to each other. This doesn't even begin to include Israel, who is, of course, basically an enemy of all these states. So the Israeli attack shows a complete absence of strategic grand strategy. It's just shocking. And
why is it shocking? It was started because Netanyahu needs war to stay in power. They don't have strategy other than Netanyahu wanting to stay in power. He's unpopular. He's about ready to go to prison with a trial. He's trying to remake the judiciary. And we know that's what these guys do. I don't think he sits down and has any grand strategy. It's the same deal, Ted, in Gaza. What's the strategy in Gaza? He just has to have a warfare to stay in power. That's all he cares about. It's not complicated.
I mean, there is supposed to be a government there. He has people who are supporting him, and these people should. It's not unlike the situation here with the Congress. The Congress should be looking out for the best interest of the country.
Right.
We understand that, and these people who are allies of Netanyahu, you would hope, are looking out for the best interest of Israel. In this case, the best interest of Israel is to not get yourself attacked with nuclear weapons. So if you're concerned about the long-term security prospects for your country, you should never have allowed this criminal, he is a criminal. We agree. Go ahead and execute this attack.
But
And
they're not in the cabinet. The people who did the same thing, they left him like Gallant, because he said that he openly they said, you have no
well,
plan. You don't have no exit strategy. He said,
yeah,
okay, you're fired from the government.
yeah. So basically, the the Iranians are in a strong position now, should they choose to build atomic weapons. There's been effectively no damage of a critical kind that would stop them from proceeding to build nuclear weapons now. The Just to give you a sense of how close they are, um, one way to think about getting uranium at a level of concentration to build a bomb is you can think of the process of concentrating the uranium as somewhat similar to having sugar and water in a pan. And the longer you boil the water, more water boils off, and the sugar concentration gets stronger and stronger because you're boiling off water. So let's take this analogy and look at what the Iranian government has done. You need about 3,200 or so kilograms of natural uranium to boil off the uranium-238 to get down to maybe 60% enrichment. So we're going from 0.7% in 3,200 kilograms of natural uranium to 60% uranium-235 in maybe 120 kilograms of uranium. So it's U-235 and U-238. 97% of the work that you needed to do to get to 90% uranium, a nuclear weapon, is already done. You only need 3% more enrichment to get to 90%. So you are literally poised to obtain weapons grade plutonium with a smidgen, with a very, very small amount of enrichment capability. Much, percentage of, you'd have to destroy 99% of the enrichment capacity plus all of the uranium, the 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride, to get to a point where you didn't have the option, technically, to go ahead and build nuclear weapons. So how can this military attack be considered in any way a success? It's a political disaster, that's obvious. But in terms of technically taking the option away from Iran, it doesn't do that at all. And it incentivizes Iran to go ahead and build nuclear weapons. So, as far as I can tell, the greatest hope for heading off this disaster, which would be, extensive proliferation in the Middle East, is if Russia and China, who have been trying to support Iran, can succeed in convincing Iran that they should not go ahead and build a nuclear weapon, because the Chinese and the Russians are opposed to nuclear proliferation, just like the United States says it's opposed. But of course, our actions, in fact, incentivized Iran to go ahead and produce nuclear weapons. That's been the focus of my thinking at the moment, although I acknowledge that Bruce's more over, the more overriding issue is the failure of the Congress to do its job, and which of course allowed this horrifyingly bad decision to be made by Trump.
Bruce, unless you want to jump in.
Yeah, I would just say, at least with regard to
those are
China,
great points,
Ted, um,
Ted. So we're basically in the same situation we've been in all these other wars, where we're we're told one thing and we're going to lose. It's not going to be the outcome.
No, I would just make this observation that
I see John Curley is here tonight. John, welcome.
John, I want to just make an observation about China. China has supported Pakistan in some respects because Pakistan's nuclear arsenal deters India. So I'm not at all confident we can rely upon China or Russia, for that matter, to restrain Iran. Iran's going to act in its own interest like every other country and make its own calculations. And I see also, Ted, that if Iran does go nuclear and that it encourages all the Gulf states, the Sunni countries with oil, we'll probably end up with something like a NATO pact, like we prevent South Korea from going nuclear because we give them our nuclear shield. And I think it'll just mean that we extend our nuclear shield in a more global dimension than we already are. I don't see that we'd let them have the nukes on their own. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's my calculation.
Yeah, well, who knows?
Yeah.
I think it's a bad situation if it happens.
Is. Whatever it is, all the outcomes are bad.
Yes.
John Curley, you want to jump in? I see you're.
Hello, John. How are you today?
John, I can hear you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. I've got a quick question. Do you believe that this Iranian precedent, if left unchecked, could be used in the future to justify strikes on other nuclear-capable adversaries such as North Korea, or maybe even in the event of internal use of force under the disguise of national security?
Well, I think and I've said this in other places, it's the supreme leader, Khamenei. I think that if you look and say that the world does not really push back against Israel for the United States in attacking a country that allegedly is an existential threat based upon very little or fragmentary evidence, there's no indication that even if, as Ted pointed out, maybe it's only a few weeks or a month away that Israel could obtain a bomb, the likelihood that it would use it, unless it was attacked in self-defense, is really, really tiny. Yet, internationally, the attack has been generally accepted. You don't find European countries and others saying, hey, this is a shredding of international law. And my greatest worry, having done some work in South Asia, is that this is a signal, I believe, to India. India has never thought Pakistan should be an independent country. India has a nuclear arsenal, just like Pakistan. They're not members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They clashed recently over Kashmir. And India sees, listen, we can go into Pakistan. Now, the worry is Pakistan does have nukes. They may be deterred by the possibility that there'll be a reaction with nuclear weapons, but it'll embolden India to go there. I do not think that because I think the North Korean example is very informative, because no one now has suggested, even though North Korea, unlike Iran, actually has nuclear weapons and they're reckless and open about it. No one's suggested, well, we're going to attack and invade North Korea because everybody worries about the retaliation. And I say, that's the phenomenon that's going to teach Iran and other countries who are perhaps capable of having nuclear weapons. The only way we can keep our country safe from an invasion and regime change is have a nuclear weapon. That's what we're teaching the entire world. That seems to me very, very dangerous and going to encourage nuclear proliferation, not diminish it.
I agree completely.
Bruce, do you believe that America has lost the ability to feel shame over illegal or immoral wars?
I do believe that. I think that we no longer have any moral compass whatsoever. We have no moral standing to lecture any other countries on using weapons, invading any country they feel that they can get away with, because we've done it over and over again. It's gotten to a new level, I think, under Trump, where we boast we'll go into Panama, we'll go into Greenland, we go into Iran, anywhere we feel like it, we can go. And I think if you talk to the people abroad, even though there's certainly maybe a little bit of Pollyannish, admiration for the United States years ago, there was a feeling abroad that, yeah, the United States, we're not perfect, but we were better than other countries. We at least had a hope to have some standards of the rule of law. And it was, and I'm now involved as an attorney representing some in Gaza, suing the Secretary of State for sending weapons to Israel in violation of the Ley Amendment. But they've told me repeatedly, as much as we supported Israel, the Intifada, the only time they've now decided they really hate the United States is when we're now giving weapons to commit genocide. Before that, they elected the United States. They still thought that there could be errors made, but now they really have turned against us. And that's a very, very sad state of affairs, that we no longer provide any hope for anyone else. We've reduced ourselves to the lowest common denominator. We're no different other than our language than these other empires. And unfortunately, that's what we're created as a country to prevent. And if we want to regain it, it's only us on this program that can do it. And it's going to take a long time. It's not happening.
All right, Bruce. Well, following up on your last comment, how can the U.S. balance its alliance with Israel without compromising independent constitutional decision-making in its own foreign affairs?
Well, it's not, number one, it's curious you use the word alliance. We don't have any treaty with Israel. So I'm not exact that the alliance is there because of politics, not because we have any treaty obligations. And I do believe that it's kind of odd that the president is talking about our attack on Iran with Israel, with Netanyahu, perhaps even Knesset members, without even talking to Congress. I mean, these decisions were made to attack Iran. Congress didn't even make a cameo appearance in the corridors of power, It's just kind of an ornament by the side, and afterwards they could read about it in the newspaper. But it compromises, I believe, our sovereignty as a country, because the Constitution actually entrusts more foreign policy authority in the Congress than the president. Now, most people don't recognize that. If you read Federalist 69, and Alexander Hamilton, who is the most vocal proponent of a strong president, says, hey, under our system, foreign policy, war, all these powers that belong to the British king, in our system, they belong to the Congress of the United States, the legislative branch, because we don't want to be an empire. That's a museum piece now. People read that out of history, airbrush it out, because they just make up arguments to justify an empire. One recent example is John Bolton. John Bolton was the national security advisor under Trump before he left under adverse circumstances. I knew John Bolton when he was at the Justice Department under Ronald Reagan. And he says, the commander-in-chief clause gives the president power to go to war. In Federalist 69, Alexander Hamilton addresses this commander-in-chief clause. And he says specifically, commander-in-chief just means he's head of the Army and the Navy when we're at war. But actually, if you're going to go to war and if you have funds to fight war, all of that under our system belongs to the Congress of the United States. There's no ambiguity at all in the statement and understanding of where the war power belongs. And we have these preposterous statements. The war power, the commander-in-chief clause gives the president power to go to war. It's complete nonsense. And that adds another danger, I believe, John. And that is words have become so compromised. It's like Humpty Dumpty. A word means whatever I want it to mean. So we just make up and apply meanings to words that have no connection to their origins or intent. That's why right now, as we're speaking, according to the government, the United States executive branch, we are being attacked by Venezuela. We're under invasion by Venezuela. And that's why you can use the Alien Enemies Act. Really? Invasion by Venezuela? They can't even build a vacuum cleaner. So that shows how contaminated, the use of language has become. And without some common understanding of the range of meaning a word can have, it's just the law of the jungle. You just make up anything you want to make. Say I can do it because, with habeas corpus need to be suspended, where existential threat comes from El Salvador and all those other things. You can't even have a dialogue anymore when people are operating those different intellectual universes, which is where we are, I believe, right now.
I see Roger Erickson. You have your hand up. Why don't you jump in here? Unmute yourself and jump in. Roger? Okay, let's go on to Suleiman Wasti. Suleiman, we'll come back to you, Roger, when you can.
Thank you, John,
Suleiman.
and good evening, Bruce. It's very interesting talk, and I've been. I always believed that the only stable Middle East was a nuclear Iran, and that was shattered by my uh, disappointment with the clerics of the ruling Iran. I mean, look at Pakistan. I mean, when India detonated 5 nuclear bombs in May 1998, the next day Pakistan detonated 8 bombs in retaliation. So I always thought somehow that the Iranians had the capability of, had a nuclear capability. But these clerics wasted so much time fighting Iraq for the last 10 years. And it was more like, I mean, it's taken them 15 years and without any capability of delivering the nuclear option. And I wonder why. I mean, they should have just handed over to the military, Iranian military at least. I mean, instead of just playing paper tigers. And that's all I have to say. Thanks if you could answer that. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Well, I don't know whether, I mean, I don't think that nuclear weapons overall enhances security for the world or necessarily any country. I think it's a necessary evil when you have nuclear proliferation that we've experienced. But one of the things that's conspicuous in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is that it obligates even the 5 grandfathered nuclear powers, that's the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain, to negotiate an end to nuclear weapons ASAP. Now, that has been honored in the breach now for 55 years. There isn't any movement towards becoming any of these powers abandoning their nuclear programs. But it goes back to the larger point I was making, is that you have to ask, why is the species, developing all of these vehicles for killing each other on a more and more proficient basis? Can't we use our genius for doing better things, for uplifting mankind, for making life more pleasant, making food more available, having the amenities more widely shared? Why aren't our geniuses doing the things that Thomas Edison was doing, rather than having, when they were truly geniuses over at Alamogordo? They were geniuses. Oppenheimer, Edward Teller, Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, Szilard. And what are the genius devoted to? Learning how to slaughter and kill on an industrial scale. That's very sad. We have to get out of that. We need to celebrate the thinker more than the armored knight. And if we can do that, I think we have a path backwards. But it comes with social applause, social esteem that we confer on people who resist fighting wars, except in self-defense, rather than giving them heroes and medals of honor for being very, very proficient at destroying other human beings.
Yeah. Thanks, Bruce. Nadia, I see you're here tonight. Do you want to ask a question? No? Okay. So Ted, do you have any further thoughts? I think we went over the enriched uranium point, how fast the capability. It's counterintuitive. You'd think that the more getting to a higher level of enrichment would take more effort, but it's actually the reverse. You made that point. I think you covered the fact that the buster bombs didn't work, and I think you covered the missile. I don't think we really addressed what the missile situation is in Israel, and why don't you review that, Ted? Because the Iron Dome, you believed for some time that the Iron Dome does not work, and you proved that in the first Gulf War. And can you tell us how that aspect of what element that plays in this conflict?
If you look at videos of what is going on now, I should say that just to make it clear to people that the most of the activity in attacks and defense seems to be occurring at night, although there are some daylight attacks. At night, the sky is dark. There's no blue background that's caused by the sunlight that gets diffusely reflected by the atmosphere. And the bright blue background is so bright that it's very difficult to see anything, any dim object against the bright blue sky. But at night, there's essentially almost no light coming from the sky. And when these missiles come in, they're heated to a very high temperature, and so they're luminous. And when the interceptors are flying to try to intercept the incoming missiles, they have rocket motors on them, and you can see the rocket motors because the tail of the rocket motor is very bright, and so you can see the interceptors moving in the sky. You can tell where the interceptors are trying to make intercepts because they explode. They have small warheads on them, and this is in fact what is misleading people to think that they're seeing intercepts, because what they're seeing are mostly explosions of interceptors in the sky, very often, in fact, most often, in where there's essentially no incoming target missile around them. So it's really like a fireworks display. Now we have occasionally, I have occasional videos. I can't do it now, but I have, a talk where I put together some of the videos, and I can explain to people what to look for and how to see things. And there are occasions where it's pretty clear that interceptors have caused the detonation of a warhead of an Iranian long-range missile. And those can be seen and they're distinct, but they're very hard to find. In other words, if you have videos of the sky, you'll see interceptors going up and interceptors exploding, but you'll see warheads come in and sometimes explode on the ground, which of course is clearly a successful attack. But almost never you'll see an intercept in the sky. So I would say that the evidence that we so far
I
have.
sat beside this guy at dinner.
I'm sorry. So I would say that the evidence we have from studies of the videos, recent attempts to defend the videos indicate that the defensive systems are hardly intercepting anything. I'd say maybe less than 10%, maybe 5% or less. I'd say less than 5% of the incoming warheads. So the defenses are against the ballistic missiles are essentially useless.
So what does that mean, Ted? How does that work?
Well,
Can
keep
the
in mind,
Iranians just keep shooting missiles? I mean, can they level the Israeli cities? And how does that- missile defenses don't
a
work?
1,000 pound or 1,500 pound
What's
warhead,
next? Where does that go?
it's gonna do a lot of damage to a concrete and steel
In
building,
terms
and we
of how
have pictures
Israel
of that.
responds?
But it's not like a nuclear warhead that would decimate, square miles of a city. So people should not mix up a conventional warhead with the effects of a nuclear warhead. A nuclear warhead is millions of times more energetic and damaging. So if you look at the level, I think the evidence is there's very widespread damage in Tel Aviv, for example. So, for example, if a warhead comes in and detonates, and you see severe damage to a building, and I have photographs of that. The thing to keep in mind is that the picture of the interior of an apartment, where the windows have been blown out, the walls are cracked, furniture has been thrown around, pictures have been knocked off the wall. That level of damage, which is certainly not collapsing the building, still occurs at 100, 150 meters away. So you have, vast areas where there's a lot of general damage that people know about. If you're, if something landed a block away, you know about it because you've had a lot of damage to your apartment from the dissipated shockwave. And there's no way that the population of Tel Aviv is unaware of this. Now, what I don't know is what their reaction is.
Right.
My guess is at some point people are going to say, "Where is the missile defense? We're supposed to be intercepting 90% of these warheads, but we have tens of warheads falling in the downtown area of Tel Aviv. Tens of warheads is a lot of damage. It's not, the city's not leveled. It's not like Hamburg after hundreds and hundreds of tons of bombs have been dropped on it over days. But it's still a lot of damage in a country that has been told, the population has been told, we have a 90% effective missile defense. People must be asking the question, are we being lied to by our government? And why is this happening? So I can't predict what the effects on the Israeli leadership are, but I would be surprised if the Israeli leadership has not been feeling a lot of pressure from the reaction of its population due to these bombs landing inside urban areas and exploding. And my guess is that part of the reason that Netanyahu was pushing Trump to move so fast rather than waiting 2 weeks was he didn't want two more weeks of these long-range missile attacks falling on Tel Aviv and Haifa. That's my guess. It may not have been his only reason, but it wouldn't surprise me at all. We don't know, but these are not meaningless events. It is definitely affecting the population of these urban areas, and the urban areas are the most built-up areas, most populated areas.
Ted, let me ask you this question. It relates to the United States rather than Israel. Isn't the United States, the government, NDI, Hegseth, Trump, they're just going to lie about how much of the nuclear capability they destroyed? And if Congress does no oversight, you're there, but isn't the public going to be completely deceived and they think this was just a wonderful thing?
The American people.
Yeah, the American people, of course. The Congress is going to do no oversight. And we already see what the talking heads, the government's already saying, yeah, this was the greatest, it was perfect, and we're celebrating all the warriors who dropped the bombs, this, that, and obliterated. I think they used the word obliterated all of their nuclear capability. Yes. Where do we get?
Well, I think the mainstream press on this particular issue is undermining the president's position. Correctly, incidentally, I should say, by speaking the truth on this matter. And my guess, keep in mind that we have a mainstream press that is very critical of Trump. The mainstream press has done an abysmal job. In fact, I think my view is that one of the greatest threats to American democracy is the failure of our mainstream press to keep the public adequately informed. And I really am concerned about the mainstream press. But in this particular case, because Trump has gone out on a limb and made these outrageous claims about the success of this mission, and there has been this leaked internal Defense Intelligence Agency bomb damage assessment report that says that they didn't think there was a lot of damage done to the nuclear program. So that, and my guess is that, that report was probably on the desk of the editors at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal about the same time that it was delivered to the individual in the Defense and Intelligence Agency who was in charge of having the report done. Because that report just went out immediately. It was a top secret report. So you would expect people to treat it with some concern. But incidentally, I don't think it should have been top secret because I think the assessment should be made available to the public. But that's a different story. By the rules of the system, it was made top secret, and it should have been held carefully. I mean, it should have been held tight. And that was not an accident, I'm sure. I think if the Trump administration tries to do an investigation to find out who leaked this report, I predict they will never find anybody.
I want to do Bob. Get off.
So,
Yeah.
Thanks, Ted. I
Yeah.
see my good friend Bob Randolph is on, and
Yeah.
his lovely wife Nina. Bob, do you want to pitch in here before we wrap up? Bob, you got to unmute
John?
yourself. There you go.
Can you hear me?
yeah,
Yes.
Yes.
My question is, what is the political damage, Bruce and John, to the president for having really gone off on a fool's errand that it appears was not entirely successful?
domestic or foreign?
Both.
Well, I think that if we look at domestically, Bob, that there's at least some cleavage now within MAGA. Some Thomas Massey is attacked. Even Carlson was deriding Trump from the attack. Marjorie Taylor Greene, which is on the far right, attacking him. But I don't know how much political damage it's going to do domestically, because he still has a large portion of support, the likes of Lindsey Graham. But that could change. I think that it's too early to know what the ramifications are with regard to this particular attack. Iran may well be in a faster mode to get a nuclear weapon. We don't know what's going to happen elsewhere in that region. I can guarantee you that if the Straits of Hormuz are closed and the price of gasoline rises $2 a gallon, and we remember the Jimmy Carter days of gasoline rationing, his political standing is going to diminish very rapidly. I think with regard to internationally, I think Trump's decisions underscore a feeling that he's very erratic and he can't be trusted. And I think it means that other countries will be more likely to go their own way and not rely on the United States anymore. To that degree, I think it could be a benefit.
And
Well,
I guess one
I don't-
other question is, what damage has this done to the ability of Israel to impose its foreign policy agenda on the leadership of the United States?
Well, I think it'll injure it, I believe, because I think even the members of Congress and the American people think there's something wrong with Trump talking to Israeli and Netanyahu, but not the Congress and the American people before he gives the green light to go to war. I mean, that doesn't take that's not rocket science. And I think it'll make people more reluctant to just be a rubber stamp on what Netanyahu wants us to do than was the case before. Again, there's so many contingencies here, Bob. It's hard to be exact, but it's certainly not going to help the Israeli influence.
It's not going to help him, but the power of the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, IPAC, is still going to be very great. I agree that Trump is going to be under pressure because of what he's done, but IPAC has all this money, and everybody kowtows to them, and they are far too powerful. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has made it easier than ever for the power of money to control our Congress. And this, I think, is an issue that I would argue, Bruce may have already said something about this, but this Citizens United decision is extraordinarily damaging to our democracy because
Yeah,
it allows money to control everything.
It is, but but there are exceptions to every rule. Look at the Democratic primary in New York City
Yes.
yesterday. The guy with all the money, Andrew Cuomo, gets beaten rather handily by someone who talked about a global intifada. That doesn't look like AIPAC was in the catbird seat there. But I don't want to extrapolate much from one election. It just shows it's a complicated issue. That's all.
I agree.
Bob, do you want to share your opinions here?
Are you talking to me, John? Yeah. My view is that Benjamin Netanyahu has really exposed himself as a blowhard and basically wanted this war to end because Israel was at the end of its basic military capacity. And as Professor Postel has pointed out, was taking very extensive damage in Tel Aviv and other cities. So in many ways, there will be positive outcomes from this imbroglio or this fiasco.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. We call that the black swan effect. Things that no one knows about. What's the black swan going to be?
Things sometimes don't go as intended. I mean, look, Zelensky thought he could provoke the United States into helping him by attacking, nuclear forces of Russia, and it backfired in a big way.
Yeah.
So let's hope this is a big backfire, Ted.
I hope so too.
We all do. Well, thank you everyone for tonight. We had to throw this together at the last minute, but it was a very good discussion, and we're very early in a very uncertain situation. So
let me
and we'll be back. Thanks.
Let me quote Albert Einstein in this one, where he says, "Brilliance is limited, but stupidity is not."
Is infinite. Infinite. That was Conrad
infinite.
said the same thing.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, stupidity is infinite. Yeah, wisdom is rationed, but stupidity is infinite.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, bye. Have a good
Bye-bye.
evening.
Bye.